The first thing Mateo learned about hunger was that it had a sound. It was not the dramatic sound people imagined, not a stomach growling in a silent room. Hunger sounded like fabric rubbing together when men shifted in a crowded truck bed. It sounded like dry lips smacking in the dark. It sounded like somebody 2 feet away whispering a prayer they had already whispered 6 times before, because words were all he had left to swallow. Mateo had left northern South America with a photograph folded inside a plastic bag. In the picture, his daughter Lucia was missing her 2 front teeth, smiling like the world had never denied her anything. His son Daniel stood beside her in a shirt that had once been white and now carried the permanent color of dust. Their mother, Elena, stood behind them with one hand on each shoulder, looking into the camera with the kind of tired steadiness that had kept the family alive for years. He carried that picture under his shirt through buses, on foot, across checkpoints, through rooms where men demanded cash in voices so casual it made the fear worse. The coyotes never raised their voices when they wanted money. They did not need to. They had already sold the illusion that they were helping. After that, every threat could sound like business. Mateo had not been a reckless man back home. He had worked where he could, hauled crates, repaired fencing, unloaded produce trucks, done the kind of labor that left no record except in the body. But inflation had eaten wages faster than wages could be earned. His mother needed medicine, Lucia needed school supplies. Daniel had started pretending he was not hungry so the others could eat. Mateo saw that lie too clearly. A father can survive many humiliations. Watching his son become generous with emptiness was not one of them. He had also watched what happened to a man who refused the wrong people. His cousin Rodrigo was 28 years old when he said no to the men on motorcycles who wanted a percentage of his produce stall's revenue. They visited him again that night and left him with 2 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and a message written in blood. The next refusal would be answered with a visit to his children's school. Rodrigo paid after that. He paid for 2 years until he could not pay any more, at which point they took the stall and everything in it and told him to be grateful he still had his legs. Mateo had watched this from close enough. He had helped Rodrigo carry the boxes that were not his anymore out of the stall. He had been in the room when Rodrigo told his wife. He had seen what it did to a man's eyes, the specific way the light changes when someone takes from you what cannot be given back. When the same men came to Mateo with the same proposition, a percentage they called it, a contribution, a business arrangement, he told them he needed a week to think about it. He used that week to say goodbye to his mother, to hold his children longer than they thought was necessary, and to make a plan with Elena. She would stay behind with the children until he could send enough to make the journey safe. He would send word once he knew where he was and what it looked like. He would never stop sending money. He would find a way. So he left. At first, the journey was a geography of rumor. Someone said this route was safer. Someone said that crossing there cost less. Someone said the men in blue uniforms at one checkpoint could be bribed, but the ones at the next checkpoint wanted phones, not cash. Every mile forward required surrendering something: money, sleep, pride, trust. In Colombia, the first leg went smoothly by the standards of such journeys, which meant nobody died and nobody was robbed badly enough to need a hospital. Mateo traveled by bus through mountain country, watching the landscape change outside grimy windows while a woman beside him fed a baby from a bottle she refilled 3 times from a thermos. He did not speak to her, but he thought about Elena the whole way. At the Colombian border, his document contact delivered a set of papers that were good enough to pass at land crossings but would never survive a biometric check. Mateo had no illusions about what he was carrying. He was buying time, not legitimacy. He understood the difference. He had a long history with documents that described a simpler version of reality than the one he was actually living in. Panama was rain and mud and a jungle track that nobody should have to walk, but thousands did every year. The Darien Gap did not announce itself dramatically. It began as a dirt path that became a suggestion of a path that became no path at all. Mateo was in a group of 9 by then, the woman from before, whose name was Carmen, and her baby daughter, whose name he never learned. Two young men from Ecuador named Freddy and Andres who laughed too much and complained too little, which Mateo recognized as the specific bravery of people who had not yet fully understood what they were in. A middle-aged Haitian couple who spoke no Spanish and communicated by gesture and shared food, which turned out to be sufficient. A Venezuelan teacher named Gerardo who had taught Cervantes and Neruda and now walked in silence with the face of a man watching a building burn that he had once loved. And two Guatemalan women, sisters, named Petra and Dolores, who prayed continuously and quietly and seemed to draw genuine comfort from it, which Mateo found both foreign and impressive. The Darien took 3 days. Mateo would later compress those days into a single sentence when he told his story to lawyers and immigration officers, because some things cannot be made into narrative without either trivializing them or making the listener feel implicated in them. What he could say was this: the mud had a weight to it beyond mud. The rain did not stop. Carmen's baby developed a fever that spiked on the second night and broke sometime in the early hours of the third morning. Freddy sprained an ankle badly enough to limp. One of the guides collected an additional fee on the jungle path in cash, with the quiet confidence of a man holding leverage the contract had not mentioned. Mateo paid. He paid because Carmen's baby was still feverish, and he did not want to learn what might happen if he refused. He paid, and he walked, and he came out the other side into Costa Rica with less money and more certainty about the kind of world he was navigating. Central America dissolved into a series of towns and buses and border checkpoints that he remembered in fragments. A kind woman in a truck stop diner in Nicaragua who brought him extra rice without him asking. A checkpoint where a soldier looked at his documents too long, and Mateo became aware of his own pulse in a way he had never experienced before, as if his heart had decided to announce itself at the worst possible moment. A guest house in Honduras that smelled of bleach and mildew and housed 40 people in a space meant for 12, where Mateo slept on a plastic mat on the floor and woke to find that the man 2 feet away had wept in his sleep so steadily that the mat beneath his face was wet. By the time Mateo reached northern Mexico, the group had shuffled and reorganized itself around new faces. Carmen and her daughter had stayed in Costa Rica with a relative. Gerardo was still with the group, quieter than ever. Freddy and Andres had gone their own way at some junction Mateo did not fully track. The new faces belonged to a wide spectrum. A young man from Cuba who sang softly to himself and refused to explain why. A woman from El Salvador who kept a notebook and wrote in it at every rest stop and got angry if anyone looked over her shoulder. An older man from Venezuela, gray-bearded, who had once been a doctor and now gave medical advice in exchange for food, an arrangement everyone seemed to find reasonable. The coyote called himself Chava. He was neither old nor young, neither cruel-looking nor kind. Mateo would later realize that the most dangerous men are often those who look assembled from ordinary parts. Chava wore clean boots and a baseball cap and chewed mint gum while explaining the rules. No lights, no talking once they started, no wandering away if somebody fell behind. If border agents appeared, nobody knew him and he knew nobody. He said it like a joke, and some of the group gave weak laughs, the way people laugh when fear needs a mask. What Mateo would eventually understand, much later, sitting at his kitchen table with a lawyer's intake form in front of him, was that Chava was not the worst person in the chain. He was efficient and not needlessly cruel, which in that world counted for more than it should have. There was a man 2 contacts up from Chava, a man whose name Mateo never knew and would not have used if he did, who ran the finances and the logistics and the violence when violence became logistically necessary. That man existed only as a kind of weather in Chava's manner, an occasional cloudiness, a careful choice of words, a way of checking his phone that was less casual than it appeared. The crossing itself was less dramatic than Mateo had imagined, and much worse. No music, no heroic sprint, no cinematic moon hanging over a noble act of sacrifice. It was thorns and sweat and the humiliation of discovering how loudly the body can fail under stress. It was a dry riverbed and sharp rock, and a child beginning to cry until her mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers. It was a long crouch behind brush while headlights moved in the distance, and everyone stopped breathing at once. For one terrible stretch, they were packed into the back of a vehicle under a tarp that smelled of fertilizer and stale heat. Mateo felt someone's elbow in his ribs and someone else's knee pressed against his thigh for what might have been an hour or 3. Time lost its edges. He could not tell whether they were moving toward a future or being shaken apart in place. Gerardo was beside him in the truck. In the dark, after some long silent stretch, the teacher spoke very quietly, almost to himself. "I used to assign my students a section of Don Quixote," he said. "The part where he says that liberty is one of the most precious gifts heaven has bestowed on man. I taught it as literature. I thought I understood it." Mateo did not say anything. "I was wrong," Gerardo said, "about what understanding means." When they were finally ordered out, Chava pointed at darkness and said they were close. Mateo remembered thinking that close was a dishonest word. Close to what? Safety? Work? Arrest? Death? Close meant nothing to men who still had to walk. At the border, Mateo's fear became physical in a new way. Not the sharp fear of being robbed or abandoned, but the cold, humming terror that comes when a country is no longer an idea in front of you, but a force deciding whether you count. He saw lights in the distance, and once, much later, the silhouettes of agents. He heard someone hiss that they had to get down. Face pressed against dirt, heart trying to beat its way out through his throat, Mateo understood what it meant to be nobody official. No file, no status, no permission. Just a man flattened by geography, hoping law would pass over him without seeing his shape. He made it through. He did not feel triumphant. He felt emptied out. A contact of a contact drove him farther north, and within 2 weeks, Mateo was in farm country. The first morning in the fields, he stood among rows of vegetables so green they almost looked fake. The sun had not fully climbed yet, but already the heat had a promise in it. He was given gloves, a knife, a plastic crate, and instructions too fast for him to catch every word. That did not matter. Farm work quickly becomes a language of motion. Bend, cut, lift, carry, repeat. He picked squash, peppers, cucumbers, whatever the season demanded. The sun did not care who had crossed a border, who had papers, who did not, who had children waiting, who had once been a mechanic or teacher or baker. It laid itself across everyone alike, but it punished the poor more efficiently. By noon, sweat ran down his spine in sheets. Dirt clung to his forearms. His shirt darkened and darkened again. The older workers taught him how to wrap a rag beneath his hat, how to ration water, how to stretch his back without wasting the 10 seconds between tasks. Among those older workers was a man named Sixto, who had been on that farm so long he remembered when the main barn had a different roof and the southwest field grew sweet corn instead of peppers. Sixto was 53 years old, barrel-chested, slow-spoken, and possessed of the kind of patience that can only be built from years of surviving things that required it. He had crossed the border 4 separate times over 15 years, going home between seasons to see his family in Oaxaca, and he talked about each crossing with the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing traffic conditions on a familiar highway. Frustrating, unpredictable, occasionally dangerous, but navigable if you knew the patterns. The first year is the worst, Sixto told Mateo one evening, sitting on overturned crates outside the bunkhouse while the last light fell out of the sky. Not because of the work you can manage, it's the not knowing what you're allowed to want. What do you mean? You stop yourself from imagining things, a house, a dinner table, a morning where nobody is in a hurry. You train yourself not to picture them, because picturing them and not having them is its own kind of torture. And then one day, the not imagining becomes the habit, and you look up and years have passed and you've been surviving without really living. Mateo thought about Elena's voice on his phone, about Lucia's gap-toothed smile in the photograph he carried. He decided then, sitting on a crate in the cooling dark, that he would not let the habit take hold of him. He would keep imagining. He would keep the pictures alive. At night, he rented a mattress in a room shared with 3 other men. One snored, one talked in his sleep, one cried as quietly as a person can cry without wanting to be heard. Mateo lay in the dark listening to those sounds and found them oddly comforting. Not because suffering was comforting, but because shared witness is. You were not alone in the dark if someone else's breathing reminded you that the dark was finite. Every Friday, Mateo sent money home. Not much at first, never enough, but enough for medicine one week, shoes another, school uniforms later. Elena would send voice messages when she could. Lucia passed her exams. Daniel wanted to play football. The roof still leaked in one corner. His mother's medicine had gone up again. They missed him. Mateo saved those voice notes and listened to them after 12-hour days, sitting on an overturned bucket outside the bunkhouse while the evening air cooled the salt on his skin. He listened to them the way other men read scripture, for sustenance, for orientation, for the reminder that there was a reason behind the labor. His English improved in pieces. First numbers, amounts, weights, counts. Then directions. Then names of tools and crops and weather. Then whole sentences, halting at first, then more fluid. He found that he learned fastest when he cared most about being understood, which meant his vocabulary grew outward from the practical toward the personal in the order that needs dictated. The farm itself had a hierarchy Mateo mapped carefully in his first months. At the top was the owner, Mr. Harlan Drummond, a man in his late 60s who came out to the fields twice a year and shook hands with everyone and called every worker partner in a way that managed to be both friendly and empty. Below him was a general operations manager named Waylon Fitch, a transplant from somewhere flat and dry whose main skill appeared to be the management of paperwork and the delivery of bad news. Below him was a general operations manager named Waylon Fitch, a transplant from somewhere flat and dry whose main skill appeared to be the management of paperwork and the delivery of bad news. Below Fitch were the field supervisors, of which there were 3. A taciturn man named Gruber who supervised the east fields and communicated largely through pointing. A younger woman named Maria Santos who ran the greenhouse operation with the focused efficiency of someone who had planned to be somewhere else in life and had found genuine satisfaction in this instead. And the man everyone eventually reported to in practical terms, Gary Talbot. Talbot was not a complicated man, which was not the same as being a simple one. He had been on the farm for 11 years, had come up through the picking crews himself, and ran his crews the way a man runs a good kitchen. High standards, limited tolerance for waste, and a certain gruff respect for anyone willing to put in honest effort. He did not talk much. When he did, it was worth listening to. He did not ask people about their documentation. What he cared about was whether the work got done. "I don't ask questions I don't want the answers to," he told Mateo once, years later, after Mateo had been promoted to crew lead. "That's not the same as not caring. It's knowing what my job is." Then came the day he nearly lost everything. It was late summer. The heat had turned mean. Even Talbot, who rarely left the shade of his pickup longer than necessary, seemed irritable. Word moved through the rows the way panic always does, faster than facts. Someone had seen government vehicles near a neighboring property. Someone else said immigration agents were asking questions at a packing shed down the road. By mid-morning, the workers' rhythm was gone. Heads turned at every engine sound. Crates were filled sloppily. A man near Mateo sliced his own glove because his hands were shaking. Then they saw the vehicles. Not on their row, not even on their field at first, but close enough. Mateo's mouth went dry. Every story he had ever heard seemed to wake at once. Men taken during shifts, names written down, hands zip-tied, paychecks left unclaimed, families waiting for calls that never came. One worker bolted toward the irrigation ditch before anyone could stop him. Another crouched between rows as if vegetables could hide a grown man. Mateo did neither. He had learned by then that panic makes you visible. He lowered his head and kept working, though his hands trembled so hard he almost dropped his knife. The vehicle stopped near the access road. Uniformed officers spoke with Talbot and another manager. Mateo could not hear them, only see gestures. One of the officers looked toward the field. Mateo kept his eyes down and picked as if his entire life depended on cucumber vines and muscle memory. Perhaps it did. The officers never entered the rows that day. They left after 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. Rumor later said they had come looking for a specific man with an outstanding criminal warrant who was not even there. Rumor always arrives after fear has already done its damage. That night, Mateo vomited behind the bunkhouse from stress alone. He sat against the warm wood of the exterior wall afterward, looking up at the stars with the specific stunned clarity that extreme fear sometimes leaves behind, and he thought, "I cannot live like this forever. Something has to change."